Let me just set up a few things. Make sure. There we go. How you been?
Been good.
Good.
All right.
Good.
How you been?
I've been good. I've been having a lot of fun. It's been kind of crazy busy, but
yeah,
crazy busy isn't all bad.
Nope. I've been really enjoying the videos lately. You're still killing it.
Oh, good. Yeah, I've got a whole bunch of conversations kind of backlogged, but I'll have some vacation time coming up. So that way when I'm on vacation, there's just a lot of conversations coming out.
Yeah. I just finished watching the ones you uploaded today, Ryan and Jory.
Yeah.
Those were pretty good.
Yeah. Interesting. The world is full of interesting people.
It was so fascinating when Jory started explaining it. At the very end of your conversation, he started just articulating how he needed someone to bear the burden of that weight. And you're like, yep, that's penal substitutionary atonement. I was like, wow. That was pretty cool. And then, yeah, that was cool. It's funny. You're like, you just articulated the Heidelberg catechism.
The stuff just doesn't come. It's not arbitrary. It doesn't just float up from no place.
Yeah. It just happens. And it's fun. It's funny that people are arriving at these different points, just sort of like given the framework, they can start navigating these places without having the theology or the foreknowledge of it.
Yeah. So what's on your mind?
Oh, I don't have too much organized. I have a couple jumping off points that I just wanted to talk to you about.
Okay.
That had been mainly like I wanted to, firstly, I guess not mainly, but the Zizek and Peterson debate. For me, it was a pretty big deal because I listened to Zizek as much as I've listened to Peterson before Peterson.
Oh, really?
So, I mean, Zizek doesn't have as much content video-wise, and I never read Zizek. And from what I understand, like his books are very philosophical, while his talks are more, I don't know. He's Zizek when he talks. When he writes, he does more serious philosophy stuff and gets more into his Hegelianism. But one thing I just wanted to get your thoughts on was Zizek's differentiation between competence and authority. And so he says, let's see, I wrote down a quote, but he differentiated between competence and authority, I think, to kind of poke at Peterson's idea of, clean your room. The Western patriarchy isn't built on tyranny; it's built on competence. This notion, and then he says he makes a differentiation between competence and authority, and then he brings in the idea of the master figure, and the quote was, which I thought was interesting. He said, "We often need a master figure to push us out of an inertia that forces us to be free." Then he says, "The highest function of an authentic master is to literally awaken us to our freedom. We are not spontaneously really free." But his idea of the master figure is similar to Peter Rollins, because Rollins borrows a lot from Zizek, but it's that psychotherapeutic thing that I think ends up coming from Lacan, is like you got to free yourself from this master figure, because I don't know exactly how it works. I haven't figured, but there's this master figure that's imposing on your life somehow, and it actually enables you to rationalize doing different things that are harmful to yourself. And so the Lacanian psychoanalysis is to realize who or what is playing this master figure in your life, and then to free yourself from it. So that's kind of what But then Zizek in that thing says we need a master figure sometimes to push us out of an inertia. And this is what I think he said, or at least I put it together, that's authority. So the master figure will use some authority, and he says the authentic master figure is one that will push you towards freedom. So you have this master figure that could be ruling over you tyrannically. You can use psychoanalysis to set yourself free. But there is a time when you would need a master figure to exert some authority on you to push you out of an inertia, some sort of social or psychological or whatever inertia. You could see this playing out as Jesus cast out demons. Like you could say he had authority to cast out, to push people out of this inertia they were trapped in. And then I also think that it was an interesting idea because one of the critiques of Peterson is he's kind of acting like this father figure for these men who are aimless and whatever. And they're like, how is this good? And playing to the idea of a tyrannical alt-right guy who would want to lead people into tyranny somehow or whatever. That's a caricature of Peterson that the left plays out. And but it's interesting that Zizek would say that it's almost as if Peterson is playing a master figure in this kind of Zizek idea, pushing these men out of this inertia of nihilism or an inertia of just getting stuck places in their life. And he pushes them out to be free, ideally, or whatever. But Peterson never talks about authority. Maybe he does in a roundabout way. And I'm just trying to piece together, like, if he does and how he does it. Because he does talk a lot about competence, and a lot of his get yourself together and clean your room and, take up your burden, carry it up the hill. It's all about your ability, it's a lot about competence. And it's like, and always speak the truth, because then you'll be more able to do more later. And then you build upon things, and who knows how much the good can build up. And then, I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on authority? Because this seems like it just stuck in my mind, and I've been spinning it around. And that was kind of the thing that started it.
Well, so when you think about, let's say, the history of the West and Christendom, you have, some of Zizek's thinking, and I don't know anything about it besides what you've brought to me. I remember listening when one of the things when I heard Zizek talking about this in the conversation, it reminded me of some of what Peterson has said about Nietzsche and the Roman Catholic Church and the kind of tyrannical master that was on the West to force the West to really get disciplined. And so then when I heard Zizek talking about it, I associated it with that. Now, part of what happens in the West is that part of the escape route from the tyranny of Christianity was the idea, and Charles Taylor goes into this, of providential deism. That, the celebrity atheists like to tell the subtraction story where, there was just all bad science and superstition, and then this bad science superstition doesn't work. Well, let's just throw all this superstition away and live in the bright, clear sunshine of being able to manage the world ourselves. There is no God telling us what to do and what not to do. So that providential deism, that very much gets into the clockmaker universe, where, but what it also does is it pushes God away. So God is no longer, you're no longer living in your father's house where your father is going to tell you what to do and what not to do. Now you're off at college living on your own, and no one's there to tell you to go to church on Sunday or to clean your room or to, not have sex with your girlfriend or all of these things out there. So now the authority is gone and you're living in freedom. The tricky thing about the word freedom is that it can mean a lot of different things, and there are a lot of different aspects to freedom. So I like, some of what Zizek is playing with respect to when I hear him through you talking about freedom, I hear more freedom for and not just freedom from, which is kind of the cheap cultural assumption about freedom. Now, when you say Peterson doesn't talk much about authority, I think that's a really good observation. I hadn't really noticed that, but I think you're right. And I think part of that is Peterson's modernity, in that it is a world absent of authority, which then really cedes the field to competence. In other words, it's what can rather than what should. Now, this gets very interesting when Peterson talks about his Darwinian epistemology, in that, so he talks about, weaponizing Ebola, let's say, or weaponizing smallpox. Peterson would say that violates Darwinian rules. There's no tiger bombs, because, but we say, but there are hydrogen bombs. And so in a sense, Peterson has to compensate for this lack of authority. Well, it's really tricky.
Well, he exercises authority in a way.
Yes.
He exercises it through his competence.
Yes.
which he displays through how he weaves together the scientific and the mythological and religious into this, he's weaving something together into a beautiful pattern that speaks something greater. And he's not trying to wield authority.
But he also says things like nobody ever gets away with anything. Now, okay, so is that karma, which is mindless, or is that authority where there's a personality and a person that one must engage? So is it a father or is it a mechanism? And in a lot of ways, many of the issues that we bump into in these conversations very much deal with those issues. Peterson is always talking about, we have these sub-personalities in us. When we talk about principalities, those are personalities, and they're best construed as personalities. Now, it's interesting that even when we use that language within this frame, we are asserting that you can have a personality operating without it actually being an agent or a full-blown person. So, and it kind of gets to like the Turing test. I mean, if I pick up the phone and I listen to a voice, can I tell whether I'm talking to a computer or a person? And does that distinction matter? I mean, these issues tie into a lot of other things in very interesting ways. And the other thing with Zizek was Zizek, some of Zizek's interesting points, which I didn't deal with in my treatment of his video, where Zizek made the point that in communism, everything was supposedly about competence. And you have, in some ways, we have this right now with the Trump administration, because obviously many say Trump is not competent to serve as president of the United States, but Trump is president of the United States. So in a sense, he has authority, and his critics would say he has no competence. And Zizek kind of flipped on that when he said, you had all of these bureaucrats who supposedly were elevated because of their competence. That's a very Soviet system, all of this imagined competence. But we also have, ultimately, we would prefer that someone's authority is based on their competence, but you notice that authority is the much more powerful term than mere competence.
Yeah, you could almost see that like Steve Jobs was the authority, and then I forget what's the guy's name that actually
the designer. Yeah.
All of his engineers, they were the competent ones.
That's right.
But they had to be put into motion by Steve Jobs. They wouldn't have gotten together on their own to make all those Apple products. Steve Jobs had to come in and act in authority to drive the whole machine.
Right. And that word is built into authority because, we have author is obviously Steve Jobs was the author of Apple.
Got all the credit.
Right. And whereas obviously there were smart engineers and Johnny Ives, the designer, and all of these people, Steve Jobs was the authority. He wrote it. And when Steve Jobs died, many have continued to speculate that Apple has lost its authority. It's lost the thing that Steve Jobs brought to the organization. And that's where you have, with Jonathan Peugeot, these conversations about principalities. Steve Jobs was the principality. He was the prince of Apple.
Right. That's interesting. We were just finishing up the book of Matthew in our church. And so at the very end, Jesus says, all authority in heaven and earth has been given to me. So go forward there and go therefore. What does that mean when Christ says, I have all authority in heaven and earth?
And that's what a point I make to people sometimes, is people are like, well, I don't know about the virgin birth. And I think, have you ever read the end of the book of Matthew? Have you ever heard what this guy claims? And the New Testament scholars that say, well, Jesus didn't really claim that. I think you're just being a weenie. You're not, either just deny it, or say he's, then you get into C.S. Lewis's trilemma. Because to actually have a guy stand up and say, all authority in heaven and earth has been given to me.
Yeah.
It's like, yeah, that's the last day I talk to you. You're nuts.
Right. Well, and then to say that and not to then just go march on Rome immediately.
Exactly.
He's like, all right, all authority has been given to me. Now you guys go.
Yeah.
And then he disappears. He goes.
All of you incompetents. Because if there's any characterization you get of his disciples by reading the Gospels, is that they're incompetent. Right. And Jesus is himself regularly frustrated with their incompetence at every level. I mean, he gets, in the Old English, he gets vexed at them because, oh, you of little faith. I mean, how many times does he have to say that? And You're exactly right. And I've often thought about that, okay, Jesus rises from the dead, and it's like, all right, well, we're just going to teleport to Rome, and I'm going to tell Vesuvius, take care of Pompeii right now. And, but he doesn't. And now a skeptic might say, yeah, that's because he can't. But so then you have to ask the question, what game is Jesus playing? And that's a
good question.
Yeah, it is a good question. And he tells his disciples, and, beginning of Acts 1, I love it because the disciples are like, now will you restore the kingdom to Israel? Which is a very, this is why.
Yeah, that was their teleology. They were
that's exactly right. And
Right.
and when they ask that question, to me, that mirrors so much authenticity, because unless you have a deep understanding of what was actually happening,
Right.
you wouldn't ask that question, especially if you were someone 100 years later making up the story. They might ask, now will you scratch Rome? Or, now will you restore the kingdom to Israel? These were Old Testament, these were people within their context saying this. And Jesus sidesteps it. It's not for you to know the times or the place, but, you'll be giving power and you will be my witnesses. And then you'd think, okay, power, so maybe they're going to go out into the world and do these crazy things. And in fact, you see Peter and Paul doing miracles in the book of Acts, but like the miracles of Jesus, they're never the kinds of miracles that we as politically motivated people would find useful.
Yeah, that's really interesting. They weren't, yeah. Wow, I never thought about that before.
Because, look, just watch Darth Vader. Because Darth Vader exhibits the kinds of power we would find useful. I find, the guy's choking, or, that's how we think of power and authority. And Jesus teaches, but teaches as one with authority.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's interesting. But then he never uses power the way we expect him to, according to all of the narrative lines that we would imagine. We were entering a campaign season, and what would, if Jesus were to hire a consultant, what would that consultant tell Jesus? Well, here's the playbook. First, you've got a big crowd in Galilee, so now maybe you take a garrison and you get them armed, and you start taking a few camps, and then maybe you negotiate with the Samaritans, cut a deal with them, so you get Galilee and Samaria, and then we'll see if we can flip Judea, and bit by bit by bit, we'll, play Alexander the Great.
Right.
And my personal pet theory of Judas is that Judas
was trying to force Jesus' hand.
That was what Judas had in mind.
Yeah.
And Jesus and the other disciples are like, don't go down to Jerusalem now. This is crazy. They're going to kill you. And Jesus says, yeah, they're going to kill me. And Peter's like, I'm not over my dead body. And then Jesus calls him Satan. And I mean, look at this. It's just crazy. And Jesus seems to, in the Gospels, not only are the disciples incompetent, they have no idea what he's doing, but Jesus seems to be going down this road, and he's going to do this, and he's going to die, and he's going to rise, and nobody believes him. And then he's going to do things that also don't seem to make sense. If I were Jesus, first stop out would be Pilate, and Herod, how do you like me now?
Right.
He doesn't do it. So,
no.
So what game is Jesus playing? And so then when, you think about world history, well, how do they conquer Rome? Well, they do it in the most crazy way possible. I mean, even then when you get to Constantine, which finally seems to make a little bit sense. Oh, okay, you have an emperor client, but, he's Arian, and, the whole thing is just nuts. So, and so I have a great deal of sympathy for people that say, it's just all chaos. It's just all, I can understand that, because I too have trouble sometimes watching the thread. But as Peterson points out again and again, things are just awfully good for chaos, because you see a lot of chaos, and chaos usually doesn't yield iPhones. Authority yields iPhones.
Right. What do you think? What do you think this? Okay. How far do you think Peterson can get? How far do you think he'll go just with competence? Because it seems like it's speaking to something, but how far is he going to get before he's going to run into? Like, I think he's going to run into an authority issue of some. Well, here's another interesting thing that, like, I think he's aware of something, because when he asked for the prayer at Liberty, it was like, I know I'm going to mess up. I just hope that it's not too bad or whatever. which I I'm reading into a bunch of stuff here, but like it's like he's relying so much on his ability to go out, perform these speeches, to tell the truth, to do all these disciplines that he's worked into his life over the years and through his trials and struck with his family and the sickness and depression and like all this. He's built up all this work that he's done to build into his life, but he seems like he's still scared of, like, there's no grace he can fall into. He's scared of the fall, because like maybe I'm just a different type of person, but like when I think of if I'm like, yeah, I'm gonna screw up, but there's the grace of God, and that gives me like this peace that I know I can rely on. When it happens, it'll be terrible or whatever if something happens. But like maybe he's more, I don't know. Maybe he sees something that I can't see. Maybe my idea of grace is a little naive or something. But that, I don't know, because I could see how relying so much on competence could really, you're working so hard to keep this competence machine going that you can't keep it up. Well, I guess go ahead.
I think it's important to recognize that when he talks about competence, he's almost always deconstructing the assertion that everything around us in the West has been built on patriarchy and white supremacy.
Right.
That's really a silly argument. Is there male chauvinism built into the West? Absolutely. Is there racism built into the West? Absolutely. Has it been built upon as Abraham Lincoln said, the sweat from injustice from the slaves? Absolutely. All of that is true. But to dismiss it as merely the product of chauvinism, of bigotry or sexism is just a foolish assertion that, frankly, the people who make it themselves are hypocrites for making that point. And I make this point to people sometimes. If you really wanted to divorce yourself from the white supremacist patriarchy, don't get on an airplane, because it was obviously white men. Don't use electricity, white men. Right. Better give up the English language unless you're born English. Cultural appropriation. You can't live this way. So
no one's pure enough.
No one's pure enough. That's exactly right. Now, Peterson, I see it the way you do. Our religious formation embeds us in a world where, so Martin Luther, when he's going through the woods in a thunderstorm, cries out to, I think it was Saint Anne, to rescue him, because his starting position was that, boy, he was going to have to work hard to win his salvation, and so he becomes a monk. Now, Luther's going to work that stuff through and come out the other side with this Protestant ethos that finds salvation by grace. All right? Mm-hmm. And for people like you and I, born and raised in this stuff, we have a sense that finally God is in control, and the story of the world and our stories as individuals will have happy endings. This has been built into us from hundreds of years of Protestantism. Mm-hmm. Peterson does not have that built into him. Now, when I say that, I shouldn't communicate that you and I shouldn't be deathly afraid of the consequences of our sin and the consequences of our shortcoming, because those things are true too. But I, like you, saw Peterson's prayer request at Liberty University, and I really felt for him.
Oh yeah, me too.
Because what I really wanted to say is that, God's grace is sufficient for you.
Yeah.
But it's important to remember the passage that yields that amazing statement, my grace is sufficient for you, is a passage where Paul is really wrestling and struggling. So Peterson, we all bear the liabilities of our theological presuppositions. Mm-hmm. And as I've said before, Peterson has theologically has an Augustinian anthropology, which I very much agree with. He tends to have a Pelagian soteriology, which means it's finally up to him to save himself. Mm-hmm. Now, if I am my own savior, I am in real trouble because I know how incompetent I am.
Right.
But which is why so I'm a Calvinist, and misery, deliverance, gratitude. The Christian life flows out of gratitude, not out of misery and not out of deliverance. So it's what his prayer request was certainly touched my heart. But as a pastor, I would sit next to him and put my arm on his back and look into his eyes and say, Jordan, his grace is sufficient for you. I want you to know that. And I want you, the point of, so when Andy Kuyvenhoven, who was an editor of the Banner, wrote a book on the Heidelberg Catechism, and it was entitled Comfort and Joy. And the first question and answer of the Heidelberg Catechism is, what is my only comfort in life and in death? That I am not my own, but belong body and soul in life and in death to my faithful Savior, Jesus Christ, who has fully paid for all my sins with his precious blood and delivered me from the tyranny of the devil. It's the first question and answer of the Heidelberg Catechism. And that's what I was raised on. So I would want to look into his eyes and say, Jordan, his grace is sufficient for you. Right. And I will certainly pray you will stumble and there will be cost. I'm totally with you on that. But his grace is sufficient for you. And I want you to be able to rest on that grace.
Right. When Zizek brings up Christ's doubt on the cross, you talked about it on your rough draft for Sunday. I just listened to that today too. You brought it. You ended up making it into a division between, instead of God existing or not, because Zizek goes down the atheist route, and from what I understand, it's interesting because he said before, I mentioned this in a comment on one of your videos, but he basically says you only can arrive to an authentic atheism through Christianity, because and that's that Lacanian master. So the only way you get out from under God is God dies, and he dies for you to free you from himself. It's something kind of like that. Mm-hmm. And so he which makes Zizek really weird, because he takes Christianity extremely seriously, because he sees it as the point at which he can be free and be an atheist. So he sees it, you come through Christianity out from the death of God. And Rollins does something similar, but Rollins retains his Christianity somehow. So, and this also gets to the point where I think why Zizek likes communism, or likes being called a communist, even though he renounces everything that's had to do with communism, is because he says after the death of Christ, we have what? The Holy Spirit. And so what's the Holy Spirit? It's the commune of believers. That's how he says it. He's like, it's the group of believers, and this is what we have after the death of God. We have the group of believers. And he's like, that's what I believe in. So he's like, I believe in the Holy Spirit, and I believe in the commune of believers. And that's why he's talking about.
This is Zizek?
Yeah.
This is Zizek.
This is Zizek. There's one good video. Maybe I'll try to find the link and send it to you. He talks with, I forget what he's a Jesuit priest or something. And amazing conversation. He talks about the book of Job in there. And yeah, I love that. But yeah, he talks a lot in that video about how he comes through Christianity to atheism, which I think is fascinating. But so anyway, but Zizek briefly said about that, how the gap between God and us is actually inscribed within God himself, this gap.
Right.
And that's the gap between the Father and Son as Jesus is on the cross paying the price.
Right.
And that this is like an eternal truth within the Trinity. That just is. The Son sacrifices himself, you know, in obedience to the Father, you know, this kind of thing. So I was actually surprised because I guess I've been listening to Zizek and Rollins for a while, and the death of God is kind of a theme that pops up in these kind of emergent church stuff that I was listening to and reading, and for any sort of postmodern Christianity and deconstruction liturgist, whatever. And so I was really interested by Peterson's reaction, because he actually, like, he seemed like he never thought about that before. That this doubt, but he talks a little bit about, he's like there's like a grace in there, and I was like, that's God's grace that the competence can't account for. It's in the I can't put it together, but I just thought it was interesting how he reacted, and then you mentioned at the San Francisco event, he mentioned it again, like he's been stewing on it.
Well, Peterson's take on this. So you have the Chesterton quote, so I put a blog.
Yeah, I read that too.
I traced all this stuff down because that's what I'd usually do, because it's like, okay, Zizek is ripping on Chesterton. I want to know what Chesterton said. Then I want to go back and hear exactly what Zizek said. And then I want to see what aspect Peterson is focusing on. And right. Peterson is focusing on the suffering aspect, which makes perfect sense given Peterson's view of the world, that, you know, the world is suffering, and suffering can be so bad that God would doubt himself. Right. Now, there's a funny thing about the relationship between God's existence and God's goodness, that C.S. Lewis points this out. Tim Keller points this out. Many people have pointed out. C.S. Lewis does it quite poignantly. He notes that when he was an atheist, he was angry at God for what? Well, for not existing and being the kind of God that Lewis thought he should be. That's essentially, and that's where this, because of the problem of suffering, which is a relatively new problem, which Tim Keller nicely lays out in his book on pain and suffering. You have Peterson hones in on the idea that God himself would suffer to the degree that he would doubt his goodness and maybe his existence. So you go from Chesterton to Zizek to Peterson, and that's where Peterson focuses on. And that's interesting, because so if we're going to play the psychologist of Peterson, you know, many have noted so Peterson had a daughter who suffered terribly.
Yeah. That's
hard on a parent. It's interestingly enough, in cases of a real good parent may in some ways suffer worse than their suffering child.
Right.
And you get that sense from Peterson. I mean, he loves his daughter. He
Yeah.
wants the best for his daughter, and he couldn't, and he watched his daughter suffer horribly from this illness that there's no cure or remedy for. That
Right.
puts a parent under enormous stress and suffering. And so Peterson is a product not only of the anxiety from the Cold War, but the suffering of his daughter.
Oh yeah.
And
Totally.
that comes clearly through his stuff.
Yeah.
And so, you know, that's also bleeds into his prayer request too at Liberty University. So and so it makes real sense that this would fascinate Peterson. Peterson continues to be fascinated by Christianity. And
Right.
but I think, you know, and as I've said in a number of places, becoming a Christian is more like falling in love than buying a reasonable used car.
Right.
And if you're going to try to construct Christianity in a modernist way from the tools available through science, you're not going to get there. And you might say, well, that's because of God, blah, 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 blah. You're also not going to fall in love through that means. They're two different universes. And reading the existentialists, he should know that.
Yeah. Do you think there's something about like how, like if you're going through up from the ground up through natural theology to try to explain this stuff like Peterson's doing, like maybe there's like, that's all you get is you just understand suffering and responsibility and these kind of more, I guess, stoic kind of principles. Like you're just dealing with the harsh reality of life. But then something steps in and then, you know, I don't know. It's like, you can only get so far with natural theology, right?
Right.
And then something has to step in and pay the cost for that, you know, and that I don't know.
Well, even our tools. So the modernist project attempts to become a tool that can see everything by adopting this monarchical vision whereby consciousness and subjectivity is excluded.
Yeah.
So what's been happening lately is I think there's been a broad communal recognition that itself is a limitation and a problem. So we'd like to remedy that, but nobody knows quite how to do that.
Can you get grace out of the natural theology? Can you arrive at grace as a like?
No, because you don't have you really lose personhood. Because
yeah.
in many ways, all of our word pictures of grace are. Well, think about Jean Valjean and the Monsignor, and he steals the silverware, and the Monsignor comes out and says, "Jean Valjean, I'm very angry with you. You forgot the candlestick."
Right.
And, you know, by these candlesticks, I have bought your soul.
Right.
That's grace.
Right. So it's all like that's the role Christ plays. He provides grace by coming in and paying the cost for because we can build up
Karma doesn't know grace. Look at the YouTube song. You know, karma and grace are living in two different universes. Now in the Vervaeke stuff, people are trying to figure out, okay, logos and agape. How do logos and agape relate? And that's very hard. But, you know, so think about Peterson and his daughter. Let's say a rationalist would come to Jordan Peterson and say, Jordan, your daughter is defective. You'd be better off euthanizing your daughter and having another. And Peterson would, you know, he'd never accept it. Well, why? Well, because he's got the image of God and his daughter is in the image of God. And he'll say, I will I will fight until the day I die for
Right.
my daughter.
The suffering's worth it.
Right.
Right.
That's agape. That
Right.
I am going to do whatever I can for my daughter. And even if I suffer greatly because of her, it matters not. I love her. She's mine. And
Right.
that's why it doesn't compute in this form of objects, because they're finally, C.S. Lewis has this great essay on membership where he says the modern conception of factories, we imagine people are widgets, that they're interchangeable parts, and we don't see that each person is in fact a unique individual image bearer
Right.
of God and has that value.
Right. How much time do we? Oh, we got only like 10 minutes. 5 minutes.
5 more minutes.
Let me ask this question, because Jonathan Pajot said in his question and answer video, he mentioned you and said that he wanted to have a conversation with you about God number one and God number two, and he just made the offhand comment. He's like, "There's no difference,
right,
between them."
Right.
He's
they're,
like,
"They're one."
They're one.
Yes.
And I just wanted to hear you say something about that.
Yes, they're one. What happens, and I think this is what happens when you get to this moment of providential deism, that what providential deism did was separate God from his creation.
Mm-hmm.
And this then gets into the question of agency. So when Peterson is having that very interesting talk with David Nasser, and they get to the point of Peterson is wrestling with the question of, how does God's agency show up in Christianity? Because if you listen to a very Protestant version of it, and especially a Calvinist version, a very Protestant version, especially an Arminian version of it, boy, I'm going to get into trouble now. Arminianism, in a sense, tries to have a line between this is what we do and this is what God does. I don't know that you can draw that line.
What? I never heard that. How does?
Well, Arminianism says, well, we have to somehow meet God halfway. We have our stuff. Right. We have stuff on our side of the line to do. Now, on one hand, yeah, we do have responsibility.
Right.
But I like, so John Calvin has this very famous section in his commentary on Genesis with Isaac doesn't do anything, with Jacob wrestling with God.
Yeah.
And John Calvin says with one hand God fights him, and with his other hand he strengthens Jacob in order so that he can fight him. and so and many people have criticized Calvinism for this, is that the agency questions are all muddled together. And
right.
But that's right. We can't answer those questions.
Right.
And so we're still stuck in there. And so God number one, the reason I labeled them God number one and God number two is split them is because of the Peterson Sam Harris conversation. Because Sam says, well, what kind of, what do you mean of when you say God? And Peterson rattles off this list of things that he's reading from his computer. And then, right. And those, generally speaking, were all God's immanent aspect. And then Sam Harris says, that's not God. And then Sam Harris lists off a whole bunch of other things. And when Sam Harris says, basically, you're just making this up, it's like, no, Sam, you don't know theology. Because
right.
If you actually knew theology all the way back into the Bible and church fathers and all those things that Jonathan Pajot is reading, God is built into the system. And that's what Peterson is pointing out. That's what Jonathan Pajot is always pointing out with his symbolism. There's no God number one and God number two. It's one God. But something happened in the West whereby we split them in our minds. And it's helpful. So then the question is, why, when Jordan Peterson reads all these things, suddenly are people interested once again in God? Well, it's because God is suddenly all around us. Now, the problem we have in the West is that people then have just kind of swung into pantheism, which is all God number one and no God number two. And so we keep having these, we keep shorting one end or the other. There's a distinction between immanence and transcendence. That's why we have two words. And God is fully both.
Right.
And if he's only immanence, then we have pantheism. And if he's only transcendence, then we have this weak God that shows up in moralistic therapeutic deism and other weaker strains, or even Gnosticism. It's got to be both. And in Christianity and in the Bible, it's both.
Right.
But we keep splitting them, just like a kid tries to split the parents to get his way.
Just whatever one suits your purposes to do whatever you want to do.
I think God is in everything and everywhere. Okay, so that means you're the only transcendent consciousness around to colonize and be God's master. I mean, that's the neat trick of pantheism, is that, oh my goodness, there's no one on the throne. I'll sit in it.
Right.
And then we find that in the story of Adam and Eve. So
yeah, then you can just do whatever you want and everything's God. That's good.
And then a lot of the village atheist arguments that Sam Harris and people like him wield, they're all God number two things. If God is not built into the system, then God is this fictional character out there that doesn't really make much sense.
What's funny is I had a long conversation with one of my atheist friends, and I went through all of like evolutionary argument for the image of the Father and the serotonin and why we have hierarchies and what that means, and like I went through it all. Like I was on a roll. I was like trying to convince him of the and he like pulled a Sam Harris on me at the end. He was like, yeah, but do you think God actually like reached down and wrote the Bible like through somebody? I'm like, have you been listening to what I'm talking about? And he was, it's the exact same thing. He's like, no, I'm wondering about this God who like does things and like not the natural theology. It's funny.
Well, we're out of time, so
all right.
Sorry about that. I got someone else after you. And
all right, thanks a lot, Paul. I appreciate it.
It's great talking to you, Jess. Do you want me to send this to you, or just have permission to post it, or
just post it?
Okay. All right. It'll be a little while. I'm kind of banking them up because I got some vacation coming. So
yeah. All right. Thanks a lot, Paul. It was good talking to you.
Good talking to you too, Jess. Take care.
All right.
Bye-bye.